Earlier this summer, I went camping about 4 hours north of my hometown. There's this small, quiet lake that I've been visiting for years. It's pretty secluded and not many people know about it, which is perfect for getting away and enjoying some peace. When I arrived on the first day, I set up my tent, and as usual, there was no one else around. The lake was modest in size, surrounded by a narrow sandy beach and woods that extended all around. From my campsite, I could see the entire lake. Not long after I got settled, I spotted someone emerging from the woods on the opposite side of the lake. He set up his tent and seemed like a regular camper, minding his own business. As the sun began to set, I noticed him walking around the lake, heading toward my campsite. He had a friendly demeanor and introduced himself as Tom. He mentioned that he wasn't sure if I'd noticed him, but he saw me across the lake and just wanted to say hello since we were both out there at a spot that's usually pretty empty. We chatted for a while, and Tom seemed like a cool guy. He was 27, about the same age as me, and we both enjoyed this camping spot for the same reason, its seclusion. After about half an hour of talking, he returned to his campsite as the daylight faded. The rest of the evening was uneventful, but the next morning we ended up hanging out again. He brought over a six-pack, and we spent the day lounging by the lake, talking and enjoying the quiet. Later that evening, we went back to our respective tents, and as I sat by my campfire, I was glad I'd met Tom. He seemed like the perfect camping buddy, someone I could definitely see myself camping with again. But as the night wore on and I began to prepare for bed, I saw Tom walking around the lake again. His campfire had been out for a while, so I assumed he was already asleep. Apparently not. He came up to my fire, but something seemed different about him this time. "Everything okay?" I asked. He smiled, his usual self again, and said he'd found a cool spot with an amazing view and wanted to show it to me. I hesitated, saying it was getting late, but he insisted the view was better at night. His enthusiasm made it hard to refuse, and I thought, why not? I'm here to enjoy nature, right? I got up and followed him back around the lake and into the woods. There wasn't any trail, so I quickly realized that wherever this spot was, Tom had to know the area well to lead us through the dark without getting lost. After about 15 minutes, he started to slow down and pointed ahead with a grin, saying we had arrived. What I saw wasn't a view at all. Instead, there was a rundown RV or camper, covered in moss and rust, clearly abandoned for years. Confused, I turned to Tom, but his expression had changed. His face was blank, almost emotionless. "Tom, what is this?" I asked, but he didn't respond. Fear crept over me, and I began to look around frantically. That's when I heard the sound of the metal door of the RV creaking open. In a flash, someone else came rushing out, and without a second thought, I bolted into the woods. I could hear both Tom and the other person chasing after me, but I didn't stop. I ran as fast as I could, pushing myself to keep going until I could no longer hear them. Eventually, I slowed down and realized I had no idea where I was. I wandered through the woods until the sun started to rise, keeping alert for any signs of danger. When I finally made my way back to the lake, I stayed hidden in the trees and saw that all my camping gear was gone. It was as if I had never been there. I quickly got on the trail, made it back to my car, and drove straight to the nearest police station. I filed a report, but the authorities didn't seem too concerned. They said they would look into it, but I never heard anything more. I can't stop thinking about what they had planned for me that night, but I'm just glad I managed to escape before I had to find out. I had reserved an Airbnb a few weeks ahead of time in a town I'd never been to before. I was meeting a client nearby for work, so I only planned to stay one night and then drive back home. The drive took about 3 hours, and when I pulled into the driveway, I noticed how quiet the neighborhood was. Most houses had their lights off, and large trees covered the yards, blocking much of the view. The only thing that caught my eye was a person walking down the street. They were far away and didn't seem out of the ordinary, but something about it just felt odd. I went inside after unlocking the door and settled in. The house itself was pretty basic, nothing special, but it was perfect for my short stay. After checking everything out, I opened the front door to grab another bag from my car. As I stepped onto the porch, I noticed the person from earlier still standing in the street. They weren't walking anymore. Instead, they were facing the house. I started walking to my car, and as soon as they noticed me, they began walking away. I kept my eye on them, feeling uneasy, but they just kept moving down the road. I went back inside, locked all the doors, and even pulled my car into the garage just to feel more secure. Over the next few hours, I peeked outside a few times to see if that person was still around, but I didn't spot them again. I had an early morning ahead, so eventually, I went to bed. I slept all right, waking up a few times, but my alarm went off at 4 a.m., so I had to get up. It was still dark out since the sun hadn't risen yet. As I sat up in bed, I immediately noticed a light coming from under the bedroom door. I didn't remember leaving any lights on and figured I must have accidentally left one on in the kitchen. I got up and walked toward the door, but just before I reached for the handle, I heard something on the other side. It sounded like someone moving around at the end of the hallway. When I opened the door, I saw the living room light was on, which I knew for sure I had turned off. The sound continued as I moved down the hall, and when I peeked into the living room, there was a man rummaging through one of my bags. He was wearing a black hoodie and ripped jeans, the same clothes the person walking earlier had been wearing. He turned around to face me, but he didn't seem surprised. It was as if he had been expecting me. He dropped the bag and yelled at me to stay where I was. In that split second, I had to make a decision. I turned and ran back to the bedroom, slamming the door behind me just as he lunged at it. He rammed into the door and then started messing with the lock. Thinking fast, I opened a window and jumped out, running as far as I could. By the time the police arrived, the man was long gone, and so were my bags. What made the situation even scarier was that when the police checked, the bedroom door had been unlocked. He had picked the lock and entered the room. If I had tried hiding somewhere instead of escaping, I don't want to imagine what could have happened. The police believe the man had more in mind than just robbing me. I just hope he never comes looking for me again. This took place in August of last year. My house was having some major issues, and I was left without electricity for several days while it was being fixed. I work from home, so this was a serious problem. I ended up renting an Airbnb for a few days until the power was restored. I don't live in a large town, so there weren't many Airbnb options close by. The nearest affordable one was about a 50-minute drive from my place. It was located in a more rural and quiet part of town, an area people often said wasn't the safest. I was only staying a few days though, and the money I was saving made it worth it. When I got there, I went straight inside and straight to bed, exhausted from all the stress at home. The next morning, I woke up early and set up my laptop and workspace. Just before I was about to start my workday, there was a knock on the door. I wasn't sure whether I should open it, since this wasn't my house, but thinking it might be the Airbnb host or someone relevant, I went to check. Standing on the porch was a man, probably in his early 30s, with tattoos all over. He didn't look like the host or anyone who would have business here. Unsure why he was at the door and not wanting to deal with it, I decided to ignore it. I walked away and got back to my desk, setting up for work. I had a busy day ahead of me with meetings and catching up on tasks from the previous few days. I don't think I left my desk until around 7:30 p.m., and even then I considered working more after grabbing something to eat. After getting dinner and just sitting down to eat, there was another knock on the door. I got up immediately to check, and it was the same guy from earlier. I wasn't really surprised to see him, but I was irritated. What could he possibly want at this hour? I was more annoyed than worried, so I just ignored him again, walked away, and went back to my meal. About 30 minutes later, around midnight, I decided to work for another hour. I was tired, but I knew if I left it for tomorrow, I'd just feel more stressed. I put on my headphones and focused for the next hour. I got a lot done and finally closed my laptop, satisfied with my progress. I hadn't noticed how dark it had gotten. My laptop was the only light in the room. I went to turn on the light switch near the front, and a sudden chill ran down my spine. There were faint but obvious shoe prints down the hallway, scattered everywhere, and they even went right up to the desk where I had been working. Frightened, I followed the prints to the back door, which was slightly open. I can't even begin to describe the fear I felt. It was pure terror. Moments later, I heard slow, careful footsteps coming down the stairs. When they reached the bottom, a man peered into the hallway and locked eyes with me. It was the same guy from earlier, easily recognizable by the tattoos. He looked surprised to see me moving around, but that surprise quickly turned to anger. His face was filled with nothing but irritation and fury. I wanted to speak, but no words came out. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned and sprinted out the back door. I ran through the backyard and into the woods behind the houses. I hid behind a tree and pulled out my phone to call 911, but I paused when I heard footsteps getting closer. I didn't expect him to follow me, but thankfully, he ran past without noticing me and disappeared into the darkness. After I was sure he was gone, I called the police. I returned to the Airbnb and waited for them to arrive. I gave a detailed description of the man, and they managed to catch him the next day. His tattoos made him easy to identify, and it turned out he had been breaking into multiple homes in the area in the days before, doing terrible things to the residents. I still don't know what he intended to do to me, or why he left me alone at first, but I'm relieved knowing he's no longer a danger. I was on a cross-country drive for a somewhat chaotic trip. I had some work tasks to complete at an office in Maine, and while I was already on the road, I decided to visit a few friends and family along the East Coast. On the fourth day of driving, I found myself spending most of the day traveling through Pennsylvania. While there were a few cool towns, a large portion of the drive took me through empty stretches of road. To reach my destination, I had to take a bunch of back roads, long, isolated, two-lane highways. As evening approached, the rain began to fall, and my fuel gauge was running dangerously low. I hadn't seen a gas station for quite some time, but I figured one would have to appear soon. However, this road wasn't passing through any towns. I continued driving in the rain for about another half hour, and just barely visible through the fog, I finally saw a sign for a gas station. Moments later, it appeared up ahead. It was tucked away in the trees off the side of the road, and it was tiny, just 2 pumps and a small building behind them. I didn't have much of a choice, so I pulled in and parked, getting out to open my gas tank. When I grabbed the pump and tried to swipe my card, nothing happened. I wiped the dusty screen to see what was wrong, but the screen wasn't even on. Frustrated, I went to the other pump, but it too wasn't working. With the rain pouring down and night fully settled in, it was hard to make out much of anything. The station looked run down and outdated, but I'd seen plenty of old gas stations before. Then I noticed a faint light inside the small building behind the pumps. Hoping there was someone inside who could help, I stepped out from under the pump overhang and hurried to the door. The glass was fogged up with moisture, so I couldn't see in, only the light reflecting through. I grabbed the handle, and it screeched as the door swung open. The moment I stepped inside, I felt something was off. The shelves were completely empty, some even knocked over, and the whole place looked like it had been wrecked. The light I'd seen was coming from the back and was clearly a small lamp, not the type of lighting you'd expect in a store. I didn't stay long. After seeing the condition of the place, I quickly stepped back outside into the rain. Something was very wrong there, and I wasn't about to stick around. As I turned back toward my car, I saw someone standing next to it. They were soaking wet, just staring into my car's windows. "What are you doing?" I yelled as I rushed toward them. They glanced at me, but then shifted their gaze to something behind me. I turned around to see the front door of the building had opened, and a man stepped out into the rain. He had long, dark hair and looked sickly. Without wasting a second, he started running straight at me. The person by my car didn't move, just backed away as I jumped inside. But the man running didn't slow down. He reached my car and tried to yank the door open. As I sped off, I heard a loud metallic scraping sound as something scratched against the side of my car. I didn't stop driving until I'd gone another 30 minutes down the road, where my car finally ran out of gas. Thankfully, I had cell service and was able to call for help. While I waited, I got out to check my car and saw a long scratch along the side of the door. It looked like the man had dragged something sharp, like a knife, across it as I drove away. Later that night, the police told me that the gas station hadn't been in service for at least a year. This happened about 10 months ago. I was spending a few days with my best friend from college in his hometown. I'll call him Mike for privacy. It was a much smaller town than I was used to, but Mike was showing me around. We went to a few bars, just hung out, and had a great time. On my last night there, he mentioned a spot he had been wanting to check out but didn't have anyone to go with. It was an old abandoned house, or maybe a small abandoned town, a few miles into the woods. In college, we used to go exploring and hiking all the time, so it seemed like a pretty fun idea. Only about 30 minutes after he told me about it, we were already making our way through the woods. There was still some daylight left, but we brought headlamps just in case. After about 20 minutes on the trail, it ended, and we had to follow a barely visible path through the trees. We walked for another hour before we arrived. We could see a house in the distance, and as we got closer, we noticed several more buildings behind it. Wasn't what either of us expected. The houses didn't look that old, but they were definitely worn down and damaged. They had modern siding and other features, making them seem like any other homes you might see. There was even a small gravel road connecting the houses. It looked like someone had tried to start a community here, but something must have gone wrong, causing them to leave it behind. Other people had definitely been there before us, based on the graffiti covering the houses. Mike and I approached the first house and looked through the open doorway. There were weeds growing up through the floorboards, but otherwise the house was empty. Just as we were about to step inside, we heard a loud banging sound echoing through the woods. We both jumped and looked down the gravel road, thinking that's where the noise had come from. After that, it went completely silent. We didn't know what caused the sound, but since we didn't see anything, we decided to go into the house. There wasn't much to see, but the weirdest part was trying to figure out why someone would leave it behind. It looked like it had been a nice place before it was abandoned. After checking out the first floor, we headed upstairs. Strangely, it got much darker as we went up, like the windows weren't letting in any light. The hallway was short, with only 2 doors and what appeared to be an attic door in the ceiling. We opened the first door and saw another empty room, but then we heard something downstairs. There were footsteps, moving through the grass and toward the house we were in. We froze, staying as quiet as possible, but whoever was outside had probably already seen us earlier. Why were they approaching us? The footsteps stopped right at the doorway, just before entering the house. "Hello?" the person called out. We didn't respond. "I just want to talk. No harm at all," he said. His voice sounded older, like maybe he was missing teeth or something, slurring his words slightly. Then there was a long pause, silence for about a minute. He didn't say anything more, but we didn't hear him leave either. We waited a few more minutes, still not hearing any movement. Mike quietly crept down the stairs and peeked toward the front door. He turned and looked at me, his face pale. There's no one there. I rushed over to check for myself, and sure enough, there was no one in the doorway. We slowly stepped outside and saw only one set of footprints in the grass, coming from the direction of the other houses, but no footprints leading away. It hit us both at the same time, and we bolted for the trees, realizing the man must have been hiding somewhere inside the house. We ran through the woods as fast as we could and didn't stop until we were back at Mike's place. Who that man was and why he wanted to talk to us, we'll never know. But I'm certain if he had found us, we might not be here now. I was hiking through a path I'd found in a wilderness area. It was a loop trail that usually takes 3 days to go one way and 3 days to return. I didn't know much about the trail or how popular it was, but on these long hikes, you generally don't expect to see many people. On my third day, however, I passed a campsite and noticed a guy sitting near his tent. I decided to take a break, and we chatted for a bit. He mentioned he was staying the night and planned to reach the peak of the trail the next day. I told him that I was headed there that same day and might run into him when he arrived. After a while, I left and reached the campsite where I'd be staying for the next 2 nights. The view was unlike anything I had ever seen, making for an incredible rest day at the trail's summit. No one else came by during that entire day, and when night came, I was still the only one camping there. I remembered the man I had met earlier, who said he'd arrive at the peak that day, but he never showed up. I thought maybe he had changed his mind or decided to stay another night at the site he was already at. In the morning, I packed up and started my return hike. I got a late start and was hoping at the very least to reach the campsite where I'd last seen the man. For some reason, I was unusually sore, which slowed me down, and soon there was almost no daylight left. I switched on my headlamp and kept walking for another hour after sunset until I finally reached the camp. The man's tent was still set up, looking exactly as it had when I last saw it, as if he hadn't left at all. Knowing that he had planned to keep hiking, and since it's unusual to stay at one site for days on end while on a backpacking trip, I called out to see if he was okay. There was no answer. I walked closer and said I just wanted to check on him. The tent flap was partly open, but no one was inside. A strange feeling settled over me, like my body knew something wasn't right. I stood still, scanning the area, but saw no sign of him anywhere, until I noticed a faint glimmer in the distance. It was a dim light, barely visible, far off in the woods. I started walking toward it, about 40 yards from the tent, and found the source. A headlamp lying on the ground. It seemed like it had been left behind, and its light was so weak it was nearly out of batteries. That's when I noticed someone was watching me. They were standing about 10 yards away, clearly trying to stay hidden. I knew in my gut this wasn't the man I'd met earlier, but I felt like I needed to say something. "Hey, do you need help?" I called. The figure stood still, silent. "Sorry, I'll leave now," I stammered, backing away. I hurried back to the campsite, thankful I hadn't unpacked anything yet. I grabbed my gear and started walking out as fast as I could. As I left, the light in the woods went out. I pushed myself to walk 3 more miles until I reached the next campsite. As soon as I could, I reported what happened. Sadly, it was exactly what I feared. The man I had met was missing, and there were hardly any clues to follow. Out in the wilderness, it's nearly impossible to search for someone. Whoever that figure was, they may hold the answers to what happened, but most of us have a good idea of the likely outcome.